Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Taylor and today I'm going to teach you how to knit for beginners. This video is a step-by-step tutorial on how to start and finish your first knitting project. I will teach you how to make a slip knot, cast on, knit stitch, cast off, and to finish weaving in your ends. Today, I will be using size 13 knitting needles and a chunky knit yarn. In the description below, I've went ahead and posted a shopping list with links to all of the products that I've used in this video. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the comments section below. Alright, let's get started. Step number 1, you're going to make a slip knot. This slip knot will be the very first stitch on your knitting needle. When working with yarn, it is important to understand that the working end of the yarn is always coming from the big ball of yarn, and the tail end is the loose or the cut end of the yarn. To make a slip knot, you are going to make a loop with the tail end of the yarn. Then, with your thumb and index finger, you're going to pass through the loop. You will pinch the yarn, the working yarn, and then pull through the loop and pull again to tighten the knot. Slip knots just take practice, but once you do get your slip knot, then you can go ahead and take your knitting needle and put it inside of the loop and then tighten the knot around the knitting needle. This loop will be considered as your first stitch in the knitting process. Step number 2, now you're going to cast on stitches from your working yarn onto your knitting needle. For this tutorial, I am just going to cast on 10 stitches. To cast on your next stitch, hold onto your working yarn, twist it, put the loop on your knitting needle, and then tighten the working yarn so that the stitch is not so loose. Now you have 2 stitches on your knitting needle. Next, you're going to cast on another stitch by holding your working yarn, twisting it into a loop, putting it on your knitting needle, and then tightening your working yarn. Now you have 3 stitches. You're going to keep going in this process until you have 10 stitches on your knitting needle. Grab your working yarn, give it one twist, put the loop on to your knitting needle, and then tightening your working yarn. Step number 3, now it's time to work on our knit stitch. A knit stitch is a very basic knitting pattern and it's great for beginners, and I also think that it's very pretty to look at. Once you have your 10 stitches on your knitting needle, it is time to go ahead and start knitting. When working with the knit stitch, you're going to think of this process as 3 easy steps: in, around, and off. Now let me explain these more in depth. For in, you're going to take your right knitting needle and put it inside of the stitch, which is under. Then you're going to go around counterclockwise with your working yarn. Off is up and over the right. So you go in, around, and off. All of your stitches will start in your left hand, and by the time you work through all of them, they will be on your right knitting needle. You're going to go in the next stitch, in, around, and off. You're just going to keep working through these stitches until all stitches are on your right hand knitting needle. These 3 steps are exactly what knitting is, so once you get them down, it's almost like a muscle memory kind of thing. I find knitting to be a super relaxing activity to do in my free time. I find a comfy spot and just start knitting and see what I make. You're going to go in, around, and off. Now you only have 2 more stitches left. You're going to go in underneath the stitch, and then you're going to take your working yarn, go around and up and over for off. Last one, in, around, and off. Now you have no more stitches on your left hand needle, and all the stitches are on your right hand needle. Now you're just going to go ahead and spread them out a little bit. I like to get them nice and uniform, and then you can put them closer together. That's how you knit your first row, and now we're going to go ahead and go on to our second row. To start your second row, go ahead and place the knitting needle with the yarn into your left hand. Then you will place the knitting needle without any yarn into your right hand. You will go ahead and start knitting all of the 10 stitches from the left knitting needle and knit them onto the right knitting needle. Once again, you're going to go in, around, and off. You're going to go in with your right knitting needle into the stitch, around counterclockwise, and off. In, around, and off. In, around, and off. While you're knitting, you want to make sure that you're grabbing the whole stitch. You don't want to grab just half of the yarn. You want to grab the whole piece of yarn, which is the whole stitch. Sometimes you'll get little flyaways, and those little babies, if you can't get those in, that's okay, but you really want to try to get in each whole piece of yarn. Two more left. Last one, in, around, and off. There you go. Now you have 2 rows that you have knitted. You're going to go ahead and spread these rows out, these stitches. Make them look uniform. And you'll see once we get a few rows down, this little practice project will come together. You will see all of the rows and all the beautiful stitches come together. Like I said, I think they look very pretty. All right, now we're going to go on to our third row. The third row is exactly like the second. You're going to go in, around, and off. Don't forget too, when you're starting a row, the knitting needle with the yarn will always be in your left hand. Your stitches will always start in your left hand and go over to your right hand. In, around, and off. When you're knitting, don't forget that all of the yarn that you are working with is coming from the big ball of yarn. So once in a while, you may need to give it a little pull or stretch out the yarn just so you have enough slack of yarn to work with while you're knitting. Alright, now we just finished up our third row of the knit stitch. Go ahead and spread out those stitches, get them all uniform looking. You can now start to see this practice project come together. We will be doing a few more rows together, and then I will teach you how to cast off. If you don't want to cast off yet, then you can keep on knitting more rows. You could knit something like a square, or if you want to just keep on practicing, then you can knit a lot of rows to make a skinny scarf. Then, when you're finished with your practice project, you can go ahead and continue this tutorial where I show you how to cast off and how to weave in your ends. For the sake of this video, and just so it's not super lengthy in time, I'm going to go ahead and speed up these next 4 rows. Now for these next 4 rows, you're just going to keep knitting just like you did the first, the second, and the third row. In total, when I'm all done, I will have 7 rows total that I knit, plus the first row that I cast on the stitches. So technically, I will have 8 rows in total. Step number 4, I'm going to teach you how to finish your project by casting off. Another name for casting off is also called binding off. You are going to cast off when you get to the last row of your stitches and you want to finish your project. To cast off, you're going to go ahead and knit 2 stitches onto your right knitting needle just like normal. Next, you're going to take your left knitting needle and pick up that first stitch that you put onto your right knitting needle, lift it over the second stitch, and then drop off the stitch. Now you will just have 1 stitch on your right knitting needle. Then you're going to go ahead and knit another stitch onto your right knitting needle. So you have 2, and then pick up the first stitch, lift it over the second stitch, and then drop it off. Once again, you'll only have one stitch on your right knitting needle. You're just going to keep doing this. You're going to knit one over to the right, and then pick up, lift it over the second stitch so it just falls off. This is how you cast off for your knitting project. Again, another word for binding off, just meaning it's that crisp edge. When you look at a scarf, you look at any kind of knitting project, it's how you finish the project. So again, you're just going to keep doing this casting off process until you have no more stitches on your left knitting needle. You're going to knit one, and then you're going to pick up that first stitch on the right knitting needle, lift it over the second stitch, and then drop it off. Knit one, and then pick up that first stitch, lift it over the second stitch, and drop off. Same thing for the last stitch. Knit it on, then pick up that first stitch and lift it over the second stitch and drop off. Now once you have only one stitch left, you're going to go ahead and pull the knitting needle towards you. This is going to create a big loop. After this, you're just going to go ahead and stop. Step number 5, you're going to detach from the working yarn, tie off, and finally weave in the ends. To detach, you're just going to give yourself about 2 inches of yarn for the tail and cut. Next, you're going to go ahead and tie off your project. To do this, you're going to take your end with the loop. You're going to take that tail end piece of yarn and you're going to stick the end of it through the loop. Stick it through the loop and then pull through. This will actually create a knot in your project, and it's truly the easiest way to tie it off. Once your project is tied off, then there is really no way for it to come apart. All of your knitting will stay together, and I just like to, play with it a little bit, make sure everything's even, pull it apart. It's really cool to see what you've made. Last but not least, we're going to weave in our ends with a tapestry needle. This needle is just a thicker sewing needle that has a larger hole to put our yarn into. Go ahead and pick up one of your tail ends of your yarn. You're going to place this tail end into the eye of your needle, the hole. You might need to twist the end of your yarn if it's too big. But go ahead and place the yarn into the needle and then slide the needle up to your project. Now that the needle is on the yarn, you want to go ahead and fold the piece of yarn so that the needle is in the middle of the yarn. Then you're just going to go ahead and weave your needle in and out of that last row of stitches. You're going to go in and out, in and out. Now keep in mind, this needle should not be sharp. So if you bump your finger, if you hit your finger, it's not going to hurt. My needle's very dull, it's thick. In and out, and then once you get to the end, you're going to pull your needle through, which will pull that loose end of yarn through your project. Then I just stretch out my project, and normally the end of the yarn will go into the project. But if you have any extra, all you have to do is cut off a little bit more of the end of your yarn, pull it, and then it'll disappear. Now you're just going to do the same exact thing to the other side of your project where you have a loose end or a tail end. You're going to go ahead and twist the end so it can fit through that eye of the needle. And then you're going to move the needle to the middle of the yarn. I normally do this just by folding the yarn in half to find the middle. Now you're just going to go ahead and weave in this last end to your project. Once again, I would weave into your first row of stitches on this side and just go in and out. In and out, weaving it through those stitches. Then once you come to the end of those stitches, you're going to pull your needle through. This brings that end of the yarn through, and then stretch it. Now for this side, you'll see that it had a little bit of extra still sticking out. You can go ahead and just trim it with scissors, and then you're going to see that end disappear into your project. And that's it. Those are the very basic 5 steps on how to knit. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more DIY videos, tutorials, and how-to videos. Thanks so much for watching. See you in my next video.